Good evening, everyone. It's Gordon Causey once again. And as always, once again, it's Candy the Wonder Pup. And let me get her treat ready. There we go. A special treat this time that's driving her nuts. A friend of mine gave me these. Shake. Lay down. Speak. All right, come on up. Oh, you want that one. I'm giving her little pieces of it, and now she got a big piece. So she's a happy dog. Thank you for watching. As always, today it's Tuesday, the 14th of May. It's right now 10:32 p.m. in my time zone, Eastern time, an hour and a half or so from Toronto, east of Toronto. And I wanted to do a follow-up video on my video of a couple nights ago. An old white Canadian talks about racism. When that video was finished, I found I'd gone all over the place as I have a habit of doing. It was very meandering. And I thought, well, this won't get a lot of engagement, but it's been viewed 300-ish times, which for my videos is something, unless it's just a very short joke. And it generated some interesting comments. One individual in particular left 3 comments, and I'm going to address this individual's comment specifically. But before I get going, I'm going to give a redacted version of what I talked about 2 nights ago in my first video. So if you didn't watch it, don't worry about it. Like I say, it's all over the place. But I just detailed my own history growing up, all the different places I lived. Born in 1966, little town of Port Colborne, Ontario, near Niagara Falls. Less than a year old, we moved to New York City, so it would have been late 66, early 1967. We lived in New York City, Staten Island specifically, for about 3 years. And then we came back to Canada, lived in the Toronto area, in part of Toronto called Etobicoke, although at that time Etobicoke was its own city, since amalgamated into Toronto. And then I don't even think we lived in Etobicoke for a year, and then we moved to a small town in New Jersey called Wyckoff. And then from Wyckoff, about a year late, I went to kindergarten in Wyckoff, New Jersey. Then about a year later, we moved to a neighboring town right next door called Glen Rock, New Jersey. And I went through, in Glen Rock, I went through grades 1, 2, 3, and in October of grade 4, we moved again to Burlington, Ontario, which is a city to the west of Toronto. It never got amalgamated. It's after Mississauga in a way, right along Lake Ontario. And I finished that would have been 1975. I finished grade 4, did all of grade 5 in Burlington. Then we moved yet again to Portland, Oregon. And I lived in Portland for for 1 year. And I did grade 6 in Portland, Oregon. And then the summer I was turning 12 years of age, we moved to Pickering, Ontario, which is just east of Toronto. And that's when we stopped moving. And I was highlighting the fact that during my growing up, there was very little to zero diversity in any of the schools I attended. In Glen Rock, New Jersey, there was one Black student that I remember. Her name was Kathy, and one girl who was Vietnamese, and I don't remember her name. Grade 4 and 5 in Burlington, I don't remember any ethnic diversity at all. I used the term lily white. And then Portland, Oregon, likewise, again, lily white. There was one Hispanic kid, Yason, I guess. And then grade 7 and 8 living in Pickering, Ontario. Now we're up to 1978, 1979 area. I started to notice a degree of diversity, but there were only the kids in my school, in my grade, when I was in grade 7, there would have been in and around 100 or so students in grade 7, and there were less than 10 children who weren't white European descendant. It was again lily white, to use that term. And then high school, and as high school, as I went through high school, grade 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13, because in my era, we had 5 years of high school. Diversity grew a little more. Later, I would go on to university, and I was going to York University in Toronto, which has a lot of international students. That exposed me a lot more to it. And I kind of left it there. I mean, since that time, I've lived all over the place. I lived in downtown Toronto. I lived in East York, downtown. I lived in North Bay. I've lived in Kingston. I've lived in Montreal. I've lived in Quebec, or outside of Montreal. I've lived in Quebec City. So I've lived a lot of different places. And the one thing that I didn't touch on in that video is it kind of gives me something of a unique perspective, in that I've always been something of the outsider. And at the end of the day, I did mention in my video that I view racism to be a form of tribalism, how we all seek out, I think it's part of a default position of human nature to seek out one's own tribe and to get into a group that you're comfortable with. But my unique life experience, having grown up in Canada and the US and moving every so many years, sometimes a year, sometimes 2 years, sometimes 3 years, I always was kind of the outsider. And someone made a comment on the live chat, which I'm going to turn on now if anyone wants to comment. Live chat is on. Someone made the comment. They said, did I get in a lot of fights? And yes, I did. I got bullied because I was not part of the group, the in-group. I would use the wrong words. You can start in grade 1. All those kids in Glen Rock had grown up together. And I was the new kid who had just come in. And I still remember the first day of school, walking to school with my sister, and Robert Shooker, I'm using the real names, he said to me, is that your girlfriend? And got into fights. And then when we moved to Burlington, when I was in grade 4, same thing again. Now not only was I an outsider, but I talked the wrong way. I was totally talking like I was from Glen Rock, New Jersey, where you talk, and it's not a dog, it's a dog. And coffee is a cup of coffee. You learn to talk. And so I didn't talk right, didn't use the right words. All the kids called their shoes their runners. And I go, what do you mean runners? You mean sneakers. And the front entrance way to the school was called the foyer. And I'm like, what are you talking about, the foyer? Because that's what they call in New York and New Jersey. The front entrance of a building is called the foyer, F-O-Y-E-R, foyer. And of course, it's a French word. So in Canada, it's the foyer. And moving to Oregon, same thing again. My sneakers, which had become running shoes, were now referred to as tennis shoes. And anyway, I'm going to read what GP asked. So how do we end immigration and protect our Christian heritage? I'll tell you something. Well, I'll get onto this. But the issue I have with immigration right now is not like everyone. I'm the product of immigrants. My heritage is English, Irish, Scottish, Welsh. And on my mother's side of the family, her mother, Bertha, was the name was Maley, M-A-L-E-Y. It was Bertha, my grandmother's father or grandfather, had come over to Canada from Ireland, where the Irish were predominantly Catholics, and they were lying, thieving, drunken, idolaters. And so there were signs up in Toronto that said, Irish need not apply, meaning if you're Irish, get lost, we won't hire you. Irish need not apply. And so the family name was changed. It had become Maley, but originally it was O'Malley. And if you could get rid of the Irish accent and change your name, no one would necessarily know that you're Irish. And again, so that was my my mother's mother's side of the family, my mother's dad was actually born in somewhere near Glasgow, Scotland. All right, so I'm Scottish. I'm Scottish and Irish, which means I should love to drink but hate to pay for it. And then on my dad's side, my dad's father, his family was of British descent. And my grandmother, my dad's mother, my maternal, or rather my paternal grandmother, was born in Montreal to a widowed mother. My great grandmother came to Canada as a widow, pregnant with my grandmother, and gave birth to her in Montreal, and then made her way to North Bay. And so I'm there. You got England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and my father's grandmother, my great grandmother on my paternal side, the father of my, this is, it's going to turn into that song, I'm my own grandpa, but my great grandmother, who was widowed, her husband had died while she was expecting my grandmother. That my great grandfather had died at sea. He was in the merchant marine and was sailing to what was then called Ceylon, what is now called Sri Lanka, and died en route. And his last name, even though he was British, his last name was La Rochelle, which is a French name. So I think it's possible I probably have a little bit of French mixed in there as well. And at the end of the day, I don't consider myself to be anything other than a human being. I'm not proud Irish, proud Scottish, proud British, proud French, proud anything. I'm just Gordon Causey. I didn't have any say in how much melanin went into my skin or anything of that nature. And I think it helps me. Developing this perspective is aided by the fact that, having moved around so often, I didn't fall into the group identity that I think is part and parcel of just growing up. You tend to seek out your tribe, your group, your clan, and I was constantly having to search for it. And I think it resonates even to now 50, soon to be 58 years of age. And I still find myself looking on things from something of an outsider perspective. And I think it gives me kind of a unique perspective, opinion, view on racism. And as was noted in that last video, someone either knows it from my social media posting or whatever, but my wife is Sri Lankan. She was born in Sri Lanka. She's Tamil. So I'm the father of children who are biracial or multiracial. I mean, at the end of the day, I think we're all multiracial. We like to seek out our tribes. We like to seek out our clans, our groups, and that leads to conflict. So what I wanted to do GP is asking, how do we end immigration and protect our Christian heritage? One of the things I've learned through reading, and this will make a lot of sense, because there's always been immigration in Canada, and it's a net positive to the country, whether it be Irish, Scottish, British, Greek, Italian, Somalian, Indian. The question now is the degree of immigration. We're talking about 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 people a year coming into Canada. We're talking about adding a province the size of, say, Newfoundland, that we're adding a population equivalent to a province every 2 or 3 years. And what that does to a country in terms of its culture and heritage, we get swamped. And one thing they have found, anthropological studies, is that when you have a country like Canada and people emigrate into the country from wherever, if those immigrating in, if they do not have English as a first language, So you get a couple moving in that are in their 20s or 30s. Maybe they have young children, maybe they don't. But that first couple, if they don't speak English, they learn survival skills English. And there's a tendency overwhelmingly, regardless of whether it's Irish, Greek, Italian, Chinese, Indian, whatever, immigrants tend to live in close-knit communities, and they like to live physically close to one another. And so hence how we have in Toronto and major cities all over North America, you have Chinatown, you have Little Italy, you have sometimes a little Somalia, little this, little that, Greek town in Toronto. Because people, and again, in terms of the English language, whether it be Greek, Italian, or whatever, the first generation immigrating into the country, they will learn survival skills English enough to conduct simple transactions in the grocery store, at the bank, whatever, but nothing much beyond that. The children of that first generation, the children, so call them the first generation Canadians born in Canada or coming over when they're very young, those children will typically learn both languages and be fluent in both. So if you use Italian as an example, the first generation comes over and they're still speaking predominantly Italian, a little bit of English, but their children are fluent in both Italian and in English. Then you get to the next generation, the grandchildren of that first couple who emigrated into Canada. And the grandchildren will typically understand a little bit of the heritage language. But other than that, they're full on English. And by the time you get to the fourth generation, the heritage language is gone. And broadly speaking, this community is now fully integrated into what I'll call the Canadian mosaic. They've adapted many of the predominating Canadian cultural aspects to their own identity, and as well they've contributed to the evolution of Canadian culture, and that can happen so long as it's not a tsunami of new Canadians coming in. And what we're seeing now is something of a tsunami of new Canadians coming in. It's not, I was bringing up how when I was growing up, grade 7 and 8 was the first time I started to notice some diversity, ethnic diversity, racial diversity. There was Troy, Spencer, Nigel, and now I'm always leaving one out. Troy, Spencer, Nigel, and Curtis were the 4 guys I knew growing up who were Black. And I know Curtis was Caribbean. Nigel's parents were they were Jamaican. Spencer's, I don't know. Could have been Caribbean as well, Jamaica, Trinidad, wherever. And Troy, likewise, I don't know with him. But what I wanted to get onto were comments that were left. And I want to address them because the gentleman asked a number of questions. And the username is JW2391. I'm just going to say JW. And JW wrote, and I'm going to quote it, fellow Black Canadian of American descent. Although I don't know if he was watching or listening to the video. If he was just listening, he may not know that I'm white and may have assumed I was Black, which, whatever. But anyway, so JW is a Black Canadian of American descent, Toronto born and bred, 2 years older than yourself, meaning 2 years older than me. So he's right around 60. So we're in the same generation. And he lived most of his teen years in the Rouge Hill area, which is actually the Rouge River separates Pickering from Scarborough. So I know the area he's from very well. And you could walk, across a bridge down at Cherry Beach, I think that, or Rouge Beach. You walk across a bridge, and one is Pickering and one is Scarborough, Rouge Hill. You went to Sir Oliver Mowat Collegiate Institute in the 80s. I know Oliver Mowat I know the school. It's probably about 10 kilometers or at most away from Dumbarton High School where I went. And he goes on to write that I can attest to the lack of diversity, to predominance of quote unquote whiteness growing up in the Scarborough educational systems. He said, I found your discussions and anecdotes most interesting. Then he asks, however, I must ask, what is your critical understanding of issues of white privilege, hegemony operating in Canadian society? I think I spoke to the question of hegemony, a little bit. I touched on it in the sense that, it takes generations, 4 generations for a community to fully assimilate itself into the Canadian mosaic. But in terms of white privilege, what can I say about that? I do know that there are individuals with racist attitudes. I mentioned in my last video a gentleman who lives across the street from me, kind of an Archie Bunker type, who still uses the N-word and says, I just don't like those people, and asked me to leave his property when I push back against it. He's like, I can't, just leave. I can't talk to you because I guess I'm an N lover, in his eyes. And to give you a sense of where I'm living now, Brighton, Ontario, Canada, I should have looked up the demographics of this area, but this is lily white. I feel like I've gone back in time. Brighton in the year 2024 reminds me of what Pickering was like back in 1978. There's a little bit of diversity, but not a lot. But attitudes have changed a lot over the years. And while I think it was acceptable back in the 70s, even the 80s, and certainly in the years before that, to be openly racist in your speech and your attitudes and your practices, now I think things have flipped around. I think people bend over backwards in order to display that they are not. It's called virtue signaling a lot of the time. People will go out of their way to ensure that they want people to think of them as being, open and inclusive and tolerant and all these wonderful things. But the attitudes still exist. I still have this neighbor across the street. I can tell you, I worked with a young lad, Jake was his name, and he was going to high school, and we were talking about sports. I told him, I was big into basketball when I was growing up. I asked him if he does any sports. He said he did sprinting, and he was really good until he would get to the bigger tournaments that included Toronto. And he goes, and of course, you got all the blacks there, and he went off on a racist bent. So the attitude does exist. I didn't know Jake that well, hardly ever talked to him. So I touched on that. Do you understand and then the commenter goes on, JW goes on to say, do you understand the difference between individual personal acts of racism vis-a-vis systemic and institutional racism? I think I do. Systemic means it's built in. It's as the word implies, it's built into the system, that the system is geared toward disadvantaging people who aren't white. And I would ask for, if you want to leave a comment, if you do watch this, we've kind of flipped the script upside down with things like in the United States, affirmative action, and this move toward DEI, I think that's it, diversity, inclusiveness. And I think it genuinely happens that people look at the mosaic of Canadian society and they say in Toronto, they say, okay, 30% of the workforce of the population of Toronto is of African descent, is black. So 30% of our workforce should be black. And instead of a meritocracy, where people are promoted or hired on the basis of merit. Now we have almost a quota system. Well, we need someone with these qualifications and you're very good, but we've got all the Indians we need, we've got all the Chinese we need, we have all the whites we need someone who, fits this demographic group. And I think I do understand the rationale behind implementing these types of systems. Going on, JW wrote, do you understand the distinctions between race, ethnicity, and nationality? And he goes on to say there's a danger of erroneously conflating all three, putting them all into the same and considering race, ethnicity, and nationality as being all part and parcel of the same thing. There's a danger of doing that. And he uses the example saying that Jews are not a race, but a religious ethnicity, and that there are Jews of many different nationalities. Oh, I know that. I've mentioned on this station many times in talking about Israel and Jews in general, that the problem is when someone's called anti-Semitic, it's not the greatest term in the world, because Semitic actually describes a group of languages which would include Aramaic, Arabic, and Hebrew are all Semitic languages, but it's kind of the term that got foisted to talk about Jew hatred, because it's how, I don't hate Jews, I'm anti-Semitic. And it was actually coined by a Jewish individual in Germany back in the 1800s. That's where the origins of this term anti-Semitic come from. But the best description I have heard for Jews in general is to describe it as an ethno-religious group. And even that's not perfect, because not all Jews are religious. So you can be Jewish, you can identify as Jewish and actually be an atheist. So there's, it can denote that one is an adherent and a follower of Judaism, but not necessarily. And JW makes the point with respect to Jews coming from every country in the world, and can be everything from lily white to black and every color in between. There's no racial component to it whatsoever. So I do understand that very well. And also I understand nationality has nothing to do with anything. George Carlin did a brilliant routine talking about a white person from South Africa emigrating to the United States. Are they then an African American? And which is why I have the trouble with the term. I have a problem with the term African American. I prefer the word just black and white. Let's keep it simple. By the way, I do think these conversations are what is needed. People need to talk. Not just, things tend to fester in the darkness. If we have these kinds of conversations, even if it's clumsy, even if, and we have to be open to hearing other points of view. So let me get on to DW's comments. Now they're glitching. So do I, race, ethnicity, nationality. The way I tend to look on it, race tends to be, one common differentiator for race is skin tone. Ethnicity, I view that as relating to culture. And nationality just happens to be what political entity into which you were born. And then JW, or what was his name? JW goes on to write, you mentioned Pierre Trudeau, immigration and multiculturalism, but what have you read about Canada's immigration history patterns? What I've read is about during the Selkirk era and how Canada very much fixated on overtly trying to attract Western Europeans, British in particular, but also Western Europeans. We had the Ukrainians and other Eastern European groups adept at farming who were brought out to places like Manitoba and Saskatchewan. They built their soddies on the prairies. He goes on to say there have always been blacks in Canada, even before 1867 Confederation. Absolutely. Blacks have been in Canada going back into, the earliest days of our founding. A lot of blacks came up, a lot of Black American former slaves during slavery came up through the so-called Underground Railroad, and Halifax was a famous landing spot for a lot of these former slaves who were seeking emancipation, seeking freedom, and a lot ended up in Halifax. As a matter of, there's a long history, and a lot of racism existed in Halifax, in Nova Scotia generally, and in Halifax in particular. And one thing I think, I don't want to be apologetic towards the people who were openly racist towards these former slaves coming up from the United States. But when you look at what took place, American slaves were held in slavery. They were property. They knew it was wrong. They escaped. They come to Canada. However, because of the circumstances from whence they came, they have no education, no skills aside from hard labor and farming. And then they are confronted with a population that is predominantly Scottish and, people who haven't been slaves, who have been educated, who quite often have skills. And so I think it's just part of human nature where, rather than trying to understand things, to get to know each individual person is just too darn hard. So what we do is we group people together so that we can fool ourselves into thinking we understand. And I think this is where a lot of racism comes from. So the people living in Halifax, as one example, saw these American slaves coming in, no education, no marketable skills aside from hard labor and farming. And so they could fool themselves into thinking they understood things. And they say, okay, this is a stupid race of people who aren't very smart. They're not skilled. They're, a subcategory. And that would justify, in a racist mind, that would justify their attitudes, rather than getting to know these individuals, on a personal basis. It's easier just to group everyone together. And then, of course, everyone will meet an individual from that denigrated group, someone who is smart, someone who is skilled, someone who breaks the mold, so to speak, and they'll go, well, they're just an exception to the rule. And this works both ways. It works with every community. Whites are no more racist than our blacks, than our Chinese, than our Indians. As a matter of fact, I genuinely believe that white Canadians are less racist than other ethnic groups of Canadians. Then he asks, do you understand the colorblind ideology and how these notions rhetoric operate? I do. I can't say I do. I like to think of myself as colorblind, in the sense that what I try to do is get to know people as individuals, and so that I'm not operating on racial stereotypes or cultural stereotypes or ethnic stereotypes. And the way you get away from that is to get to know someone as an individual. Stereotypes exist for a reason. It's because quite often people of a specific community do have it's a broader cultural trait. But no cultural traits are universal. He goes on to say that race is a social construct and cannot be undone, disavowed, and wished away because we want it to be so. I think I agree with you there in that I think it's something that will always be with us because of humanity, all of us, black, white, yellow, every shade, no matter what your melanin content is humanity. We are tribal by nature, and we seek to surround ourselves with those we consider to be like us. And I said this in the last video, that can be based on race, it can be based on language, it can be based on religion, it can be based on political ideology, it can be based on a myriad of different factors, race being just one. And then he went on to say, if you get an opportunity, find and read Viola Desmond's Canada. If I'm not mistaken, is she the individual who's on our $10 bill now? Anyway, the book is The History of Blacks and Racial Segregation in the Promised Land by Graham Reynolds. I think that might be referencing Halifax, which I talked a bit about. And then he goes on to say there are so many solid works on race and racism, crime, policing, racial profiling, racism in the Canadian media, white identity, whiteness, privilege. One of the best works on race, racism, and white privilege is Privilege, Power, and Difference by Alan G. Johnson. And I'm wondering if that's the book that I already read, and I said it was Manning. And I wish I could find the copy. It's more of a pamphlet than a book. Might have been Johnson, because that is ringing a bell. Privilege, Power, and Difference. Once you read this seminal book that has now become a university text, you will have a clear understanding. If you are sincere and serious, seek these books out. I've got to find that book, Privilege, Power, and Difference. And I'm just wondering if that was a black academic who was actually courted by the old Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was basically trying to foment division between blacks and whites, and actually within the black community itself, and trying to keep stoking the flames of racial division in the United States, for the obvious reason that a house divided cannot stand. And then he put up two more comments, shorter ones. Why were American Jews mostly descendants of immigrants from Europe? I think they would all have to be descendants of immigrants from Europe. I mean, everyone who came into the U.S., except for Native North Americans, except for the First Nations, were immigrants from Europe, able to experience the American dream, mobility, and everything else. But African Americans were not. Well, it's the same reason why they had issues in Halifax, even after gaining their freedom by crossing the 49th parallel and coming into part of the British Empire where slavery had been abolished, is because racist attitudes were furthered along by the fact that those individuals coming in, sadly, they were slaves. They had no education, little to no skills to speak of. And I think it showed a lot there. I saw a documentary talking about, and I forget the name of the town, but they built, the black community in Halifax built a town on the edge of Halifax, and it was Black Halifax. It was all black, and they just took vacant land and started constructing their homes and such, and built a way of life. And then at some point, as I understand it, the city of Halifax came in and expropriated all the land. And it was, heinous what happened to them and how they were treated. How Jews were allowed to experience upward mobility, social mobility, but blacks were not. I know the Jewish community, there tends to be a lot of what I will call cultural ethnic nepotism. And it's part of this tribalism. And I see it in the Black community as well. And this book, and it may be that one you referenced, Privilege, Power, and Difference, or it might be another one. I'm going to look it up, and I'll mention it in a later video, is that as Blacks were trying to engage in activities like the Jewish community had, like the Irish community had, like the Italian community had, the Soviet Union had operatives in organizations like the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons. There's an anachronism. And the Soviets were actively trying to prevent the American Black community from building itself up. And I'm going to look it up right now. What the heck? I think this would be a book that DW should read. I remember the guy's name as Manning, but my memory isn't always the best. Manning Johnson. Was his name. So I got the Manning part right, but that was his first name. And Color, Communism, and Common Sense is the name of the book. And so to DW, to the writer of all those comments, I will say, if you are serious about learning some of this history, I would strongly recommend reading Color, Communism, and Common Sense. And I'll give you the review. I have a copy of it somewhere in this house. I have boxes, reams and reams of books that are just sitting in boxes. I'm going to read you the review from Goodreads, give you a sense. This gentleman Manning Johnson had been recruited by the Soviets. It's from 1958. The story of one Black American communist who became disillusioned with communism. Always get pop-ups. And penned his cautionary tale of the perils of his experience. According to the author, 10 years I labored in the cause of communism. I was a dedicated comrade. All my talents and efforts were zealously used to bring about the triumph of communism in America and throughout the world. To me, the end of capitalism would mark the beginning of an interminable period of plenty, peace, prosperity, and universal comradeship. All racial and class differences and conflicts would end forever after the liquidation of the capitalists. And I would strongly recommend reading that, especially when we consider that, when you have the Black Lives Matter movement is so overtly Marxist, Karl Marx, in its ideologies. And it strikes me that this communistic influence certainly within the academic end of the Black community in the United States, it hasn't stopped. And I think this is something we need to talk about openly, candidly, without fear of someone trying to cancel. Because, we live in this era of cancel culture where if you say the wrong thing, if you express the wrong idea, then your voice is shut out. And this idea that opinions and ideas can be wrong, that in of itself is wrong. That's fascism on steroids. Communism and fascism do share a dictatorial element that seeks to control and to micromanage humanity. And anyway, I've said about as much as on racism and about tribalism. I think racism is just one manifestation of tribalism, and I think sadly it's just the default position of humanity to be tribal. And we're seeing that in the conflict between Israel, between the Israeli Palestinians and the Arab Palestinians. I'm going to start calling them both Palestinians, because Palestine was a mandate under the British from 1920 until 1948. And so everyone who lived there, Palestinian is a national identity based on the mandate that the British ruled for 28 years. So anyone living there, whether they're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Druze, whatever, Buddhist, Shinto, anyone living in Palestine was a Palestinian. So if you're going to continue to call one group Palestinians, well, then the Jews living in what's Israel now, they're Jewish Palestinians. But my next video, which I'm going to do tomorrow, that's the intention, I'm going to talk about the sign of Jonah, and that's pretty much it. There's been some talk about on April 8th, when the eclipse took place, about the sign of Jonah. And tribalism plays into that as well, if you understand what the sign of Jonah is. It's a passage in Matthew where Jesus is in a conversation with the scribes and the Pharisees. The religious leaders are challenging Jesus, and they tell Jesus, they say, "Show us a sign." And Jesus says, a wicked and adulterous generation seeks a sign, but no sign shall be given unto it except for the sign of Jonah. And then later he goes on to say that and you have to know the book, so I'm not going to tell anymore, because I'm going to talk tomorrow about Jonah is one of the smaller books in the Bible. Many will know the story about Jonah and the whale, or the great fish, or the great sea creature. But you need to understand the full story. And I think that helps to define when Jesus was talking about what is the sign of Jonah. Jesus describes elements of it, but you have to know the story first. And as I say, it's one of the shortest books in the Bible. So that will be tomorrow. GP, thanks for your comment. How do we end immigration and protect our Christian heritage? Even without immigration, even if Canada had, we would be a secular. We cannot blame the fallen state of Canadian Christianity on immigrants. It's the fault of Christians, the broader culture. We started on this slope a long time ago, long before immigration was liberalized. We were already on the slippery slope. And a lot of people coming into Canada, especially Filipinos, largely Christian. A lot of Chinese coming into Canada, largely Christian. A lot of people coming from India are Christians. In the broadest sense of the word, because a lot are Roman Catholics. Certainly Filipinos are predominantly Roman Catholic, but not always. I've met lots of Filipinos in evangelical churches. Anyway, God bless. Thank you for watching. Thank you for the one like. It probably doesn't deserve any more than that. This video was worse than my one 2 nights ago. Hopefully I'll get back on track. tomorrow when I talk about the sign of Jonah, what it is, what it means. And we're the 14th now, so I'll be on the 15th. And I've got to get it done before the 18th because that's significant. Anyway, God bless. Talk to you later.